public hanging. There's a hot dog and beer public hanging. There'll be music, but we're public hanging. Holy hope for public hanging. Somebody get a grown man dog. You're looking in the street, man dog. Rather be ready, man dog.
All right, my friends, welcome to the weekend interview show for the 2nd of April, 2005. I'm Scott Horton, and my website is weekendinterviewshow.com. I keep all of the archives in MP3 format for you there. I'm an editorial assistant and a new writer for antiwar.com, and I should start the show actually today with the headlines from the front pages of antiwar.com. From Reuters, Rogelio Manulet, who was convicted of, quote, assault with intent to commit voluntary manslaughter on Thursday for the cold-blooded murder of a wounded Iraqi, was sentenced to dismissal from the Army. According to NBC News, the Abu Ghraib prison, famous for torture by American soldiers, was attacked by insurgents today, up to 18 people wounded or killed. From the Associated Press, government wiretaps and searches in the United States are up 75% from the year 2000. There's an interview, an audio interview of Scott Ritter by Charles Goyette about the Bush administration plans to attack Iran, and the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission's report is a joke. As the old republic falls and is replaced by tyranny and empire, the Weekend Interview Show remains committed to calling the score on America's path to total despotism. Our guests today are both part of a new 2-book set to be released soon by IHS Press entitled Neoconned and Neoconned Again, Just War Principles, a Condemnation of War with Iraq. Jude Winieski will be back in the second hour to discuss his chapter, The Bogus Case Against Saddam. But first, the editor of Neoconned, J. Forrest Sharpe. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks, Scott.
It's great to have you on. So first, please tell me a little bit about IHS Press and why you chose the title for this book, Neoconned.
Well, IHS started, Scott, as a reprint project to bring back books on social, political, and economic questions because, frankly, we're fed up with what we're offered by both mainstream political parties, the Republicans, the Democrats, simply rehash the same platitudes and the same nonsense. And so we discovered a kind of historical wealth of information in what, frankly, is I have to say, Catholic writing from the 30s and 40s that is inaccessible, unavailable, but very, very compelling, and really speaks to the needs that we face in the modern world. So that's the background to IHS, is to bring some of these books back into print. The Neoconned series is the first couple of books under a new imprint that we have called Light in the Darkness Publications that is designed to deal with current events and current issues. And the project for these 2 books on the war came originally from a desire to again, sticking with this reprint vision, to go back and look at the old-fashioned Christian just war theory and doctrine, which has been around for some 1,500 years or more, which always put a limit on occasions in which you can go to war. We thought about trying to reprint an old book that laid out the old-fashioned, more rigorous doctrine on just war principles. And, again, in light of the current events at that time, that was probably 2002, before the Iraq War. But then we were so fed up, frankly, with the nonsense of this war that we thought, let's forget the reprint idea and get some current writers to jump in on this issue.
And speaking of which, some of those writers are Justin Raimondo, Pat Buchanan, Samuel Francis, Joe Sobran, Charlie Reese, Thomas Fleming, Clace Wren, Noam Chomsky, Robert Fisk, Karen Katowski, Ray McGovern, Gordon Prather, and the list goes on. We'll be right back talking with the editor of Neoconned, J. Forrest Sharpe, on the Weekend Interview Show. welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, talking with J. Forrest Sharpe. He's the editor of a new book called Neocon. It's going to come out soon, put out by IHS Press. And it's basically two books full of, I guess, maybe 30 or so essays by the most prominent libertarian, paleoconservative, and liberal writers, along with Catholic clergy, describing and weighing the just war standard versus American foreign policy. And that's an interesting point, as the Pope just died about an hour ago, to get into just exactly what is the Catholic just war doctrine, where it comes from, and how does it apply to our current foreign policy. Mr. Sharpe?
Well, thanks for the news, Scott. I hadn't heard that, so God bless them, and we'll see what happens. But, that's one of the I guess important of his accomplishments was to really take a public stand on this war. The just war position really was formulated by the best minds of Western philosophy, going all the way back to the Greeks and Romans, the Stoics and Cicero and some of these other famous names who really, in a kind of quaint and old-fashioned way, believed that morality should limit politics. I mean, they didn't live under this impression like we do today that you have to be nice to your neighbor, but once you're in government or in business, all bets are off, if you follow me.
Right.
The best thinkers of the Christian church in the 400s, 500s, 600s always look back to the thinkers of Greece and Rome for their starting point, and then they just added their kind of Christian nuance to it. St. Augustine was obviously one of the big names who formulated the just war position, St. Thomas after him, and then some of the Spaniards in the 16 and 1700s who continued thinking based on the same principles, but then they adapted the doctrine to account for, the further development of civilization, which was more complex, obviously, in those times. And it really comes down to us, with the same principles, but perhaps expanded a little bit to deal with modern situation. If you want to get into it, we can summarize very quickly, what the just war response to this aggression in Iraq is, if now is a good time.
Yeah, that sounds great. In fact, in one of your articles in the book by David Lutz, Unjust War Theory, Christian Zionism and the Road to Jerusalem, he lays out the just war theory and divides it in two parts: just ad bellum and just ad bello. What does that mean? Yeah, well,
those are the old Latin phrases that the philosophers used to use. The jus, or jus, meaning law, and the ad bellum. Bellum, of course, is war. When you say someone is bellicose, they're acting in a warlike manner. So the word comes from that Latin term for war, bellum or bello. And the ad bellum is simply the criteria for going to war. In other words, what standards do you have to meet before it's okay for you to go to war? And the in bello standards are what moral limits are there to what you can do during the war. And to me, the clearest standard on the ad bellum side, or the question of, is it okay to go to war in the case of Iraq, is this notion of having a just cause. You have to have a just cause, and the just cause can't be a kind of vague, well, we don't like the Iraqis, or the Iraqis don't like Americans, or Saddam may be a little bit dangerous, or maybe he has weapons. All this kind of vague equivocation is totally ruled out by the just war position, despite what modern theorists like Michael Novak and George Weigel would claim. I mean, their interpretation of this position is totally wrong, and I think, in fact, they're smart enough guys that I would be willing to go out on a limb and say that their interpretation of the just war theory is willfully or a willful misrepresentation of the real just war position, because the writers going back all the way to St. Augustine, all the way through to very recent guys, clerics from the 60s and 70s who were writing on this same theory, say that you have to be absolutely certain either that you've been attacked or that an attack is imminent. In other words, Saddam would have had to have a Navy or an Air Force that was on its way into New York Harbor or on its way to bomb Atlanta, or paratroopers jumping out of Iraqi troop-carrying aircraft to land in the U.S. before we could say unequivocally, yes, it's time to defend ourselves in an act of war.
That is the bottom line of one of the essays in the book by Reverend Juan Carlos Iscara. Might is not right, why preventive war is immoral. And he makes the distinction, I believe the one you were just making, between preemption and prevention.
Absolutely.
And a preventive war meaning, well, someday they might hurt us, a preemptive war, meaning, oh, they're definitely on their way to hurt us right now.
Absolutely. And let me give you a quick analogy. I mean, the sense is, I've never met you face to face. I hope to have the pleasure someday, but imagine you and I are passing on the street. I've never seen you. You've never seen me. You look probably like a big guy, kind of dangerous. I think, well, someday, if I provoke you, you might punch me in the face. So just to make sure, I'm going to blow your head off. So just on the off chance that you may get mad at me someday. Obviously, relations between men, everybody, aside from the wackos out there, would acknowledge that's totally uncalled for and illegitimate, and I would probably be tried and convicted of murder, and rightly so.
But isn't it totally different when we're talking about nation states?
Oh, absolutely not. Because again, the question is it okay in political affairs or in foreign policy to totally neglect the requirements of justice and morality? Now, there are some in this country who would argue yes, but, the old phrase, you reap what you sow, you don't particularly have to be a religious person to recognize at some point you're digging your own grave following that course. Clearly, if Saddam was on the verge of launching an attack against us, no one argues that we have to sit around and wait to be attacked before we can preempt that attack. And that gets back to this term of preemption, that if there's an attack that's brewing, you're certainly more than welcome to strike first. If you have a hunch that Saddam might want to attack you someday, 10, 15 years from now, there's certainly no grounds to go to war to deprive him of that capability to attack, a capability which, I might add, all the inspectors evidently demonstrated that he didn't have, and which for us wasn't really even part of the question. For some of these just war theorists, their argument is not that we should verify someone has capability and intent before going to war. Their argument is if you kind of suspect they don't follow the American ideology, they're quote-unquote anti-American, and they may pose a danger to you at some point, then you can go and obliterate them. And, you may have heard of this book by Michael Scheuer, the the CIA agent or employee who up till a short time ago was anonymous, wrote an excellent book called Imperial Hubris, Why the West is Losing the War on Terror. And he makes the point, and he's a patriot, he's a pro-American guy. He's not not a crazy leftist who's raised on anti-Americanism, but he makes the point that this kind of lawless behavior where you're going to go around and destroy your enemies and attack your enemies long before there's any indication they have any intention of doing anything to you is actually provoking terrorism and provoking more response by our enemies. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, the other people in the world outside of our borders are human beings. They deserve to be treated with justice and fairness, and I think if we behave that way a little more, we probably would have less problems from a political and foreign policy standpoint. Well,
Scheuer says that America is bin Laden's indispensable ally, and that everything we do makes him more and more powerful.
Absolutely.
And, of course, the reverse is also true, and throughout your book, author after author of these articles point out that September 11th was a godsend to these neoconservatives who had always kind of been on the third and maybe second level policy positions, but never really got to call the shots until those buildings fell down.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think the article in the second book by Stephen Snigoski, which is something along the lines of, I don't have the table of contents in front of me. You do, perhaps. It's in 9/11 Israel and the war in Iraq, but he makes that point that these guys were waiting in the wings to a large extent, and they even wrote, and this is the thing to me I find so remarkable, and depending upon whether you believe in coincidence or not, it's an interesting perspective that many of them had written. In order to implement their policies, they were waiting for another Pearl Harbor type event because that was the only thing that was going to shock the national consciousness enough to allow them to put some of these policies into place. And I think
in fact, Brzezinski, who's not a neoconservative but is a traditional middle-of-the-road
realist,
international side,
call him.
He wrote the very same thing in the Grand Chessboard.
Yeah, and and it's sad, and I think clearly there's an exploitation of this anger over 9/11, and on a very short, quick tangent, my sense is that the response to 9/11 already indicated the kind of lawless direction in which American foreign policy was heading, from the standpoint that, I would have been the first to cheer a military response to 9/11 had we taken a few minutes to really investigate in a serious and responsible way who was responsible, how they pulled it off, etc. But as you and I'm sure many of your listeners know, it was another knee-jerk. The CNN and the rest of the major networks were mentioning bin Laden within hours after the thing had happened, and of course there's no basis for concluding that Wolf Blitzer and these other rocket scientists know the first thing about real intelligence work. And our approach to Afghanistan was the same as to Iraq. We demanded that bin Laden be handed over. They very legitimately asked for proof and for evidence in his involvement in this. And our response was typically bellicose. We don't negotiate with terrorists. We give you 24 hours or we're going to bomb you. And that was that. And so it was a sad start, but it culminated in Iraq, and hopefully not too many more nations. But we'll have to see how that develops.
They're sort of conflating all their would-be enemies together into a group that didn't necessarily exist, where Al-Qaeda wasn't the same thing as the Taliban, but they immediately conflated those two things together. And then they basically are just trying to say radical Islam all the way between here and there on the map is our enemy, which is basically, at least 1 billion people.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a good word you use, Scott, when you say conflating, because there's another interview in our book by Jeffrey Record, who's a professor of strategy at the Air War College in Alabama, who says that's the biggest mistake of U.S. strategy at this point is to conflate this notion of Al-Qaeda with Iraq, because Iraq was a secular regime that certainly posed no threat to the U.S., but that didn't stop us, unfortunately.
Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, talking with J. Forrest Sharpe from IHS Press, editor of the new 2-book series, Neocon. Why is it called Neocon? Why not just Republicon?
Well, Scott, because, obviously the con draws the focus to the fact that this whole operation in Iraq was really foisted on the American people based on, at worst, lies. If you put the best spin on it, you can. It's misrepresentation by ignorant and uninformed people, but I really have a hard time believing there wasn't some willful deception involved. The neo comes in really to highlight the role of the neoconservatives, who for a long time have been, as you mentioned earlier in our discussion, kind of flitting around the outskirts or the periphery of the foreign policy and the political establishment in this country, occupying lots of low and mid-level political appointee posts. And this project to reshape the Middle East in America's image, or even better, in their image, is really a neoconservative project from start to finish. And so we thought no better way to capture those 2 points than to illustrate that we were conned, but neoconned, really, because of their ascendancy and their having foisted their vision on the American political process and on the American people.
I think someone who studies the neoconservatives might come to the conclusion that neo means not.
Exactly.
If you really look at the core of neoconservative principle, they seem to accept the permanent warfare state, centralized government planning. They accept the warfare state. They accept the regulatory state. There's nothing, I think typical baseline conservative principle kind of wishes that the New Deal had never happened, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And, I think the biggest thing working in their favor that helps them to misrepresent themselves as traditional conservatives rather than as really, militant liberals is strictly the military aspect. They certainly have a view of American military power, that it should be used under all circumstances to export the American way of life and to shape the world according to American dictates. And it is, I think, correct to say that typically, I grew up, I was young in the Reagan years and, was quote-unquote very patriotic, which meant I was looking forward to an opportunity to go to war with the Soviets. Now, the Soviets were not good guys by no means, but I'm not sure that it's prudent to grow up with just waiting for an excuse to go to war. That said, this sense that we're going to employ American military might, do what we need to do on the ground with tanks, troops, guns, bullets. That's a kind of manly, exciting prospect if you leave out the question of what aims we're pursuing. So I think they have that working to their favor among mainstream conservative circles, as they talk the militarist jingo that tends to get, all real red-blooded American men fired up. And it's fair that that's the case, but the problem is you shut off your thought process as to what aims are we pursuing by employing the American military, and that's their Achilles heel as far as I'm concerned.
You have a section in the book with 4 or 5 essays, the section called Conservative and Anti-War, that features Joseph Sobrin, Sam Francis, Thomas Fleming, Paul Gottfried, and Eric Margolis, Charlie Reese. Can you briefly tell us basically what kind of arguments they're making in this section?
Yeah, as you noted, these guys are all very high-profile, mainstream, respected conservative writers. To the extent that someone would argue with my use of the term mainstream, I think that's a sad comment on what conservatism is today rather than on where these guys are. The title of that section, Conservative and Anti-War, really sums it up from the standpoint that with a little bit of difference, or subtle difference in argumentation between the 6 or 7 articles that come in that section, they are all making the point that a real conservative would have been against this war. Margolis is a foreign policy expert from Canada, so his argument is that this is gravely imprudent and will have bad consequences for the U.S. So from the conservative standpoint, it shouldn't have been done and should be opposed. Fleming's argument is that historically, attempts to occupy Iraq have ended in failure. All you have to do is look at the history of the British experiment in the early part of the 1900s. So again, from a conservative sense that has a real historical consciousness and awareness, the war was a bad project. Charlie Reese, always really good and really to the point. His piece is short, maybe a page and a half or 2 pages in our book, but he says the idea that America is not bound by the law, and so we can remake other nations in our image, disregarding international law and disregarding the moral law, is absolutely wrong. And that obviously marks him as a real leader or a leading voice in the conservative movement. Sobran's article is much the same, obviously with different examples and different argumentation. Francis, I think, has one of the best articles in that section, Refuge of Scoundrels, Patriotism, True or False in the Iraq War Controversy. And the highlight of his piece is, he's passed away here over the last couple of months, God rest his soul. And this is one of the last original pieces that he composed before he died. And it is a new reply to that screed that was written by David Frum in the National Review, arguing that the anti-war conservatives are somehow unpatriotic. Francis fires back with a full volley, all guns blazing against this nonsense from Frum, arguing that real patriots are going to have a loyalty to the culture, to the citizenry, and patriotism may mean, in some cases, opposing the aims of your government.
Well, I thought patriotism just meant really liking the pretty colors of the flag as it waves on Fox News Channel.
Sadly, that's the
shock and awe.
Yeah, sadly, that's as deep as it gets for many of these guys. But I think Francis's piece is really irrefutable.
All right, it's a weekend interview show. I'm talking with J. Forrest Sharpe from IHS Press. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.
Show. I'm Scott Horton talking with J. Forrest Sharpe from IHS Press. He's the editor of a new book called Neocon, 2-book series actually, full of, I don't know how many essays, 30 or 40 essays?
Well, it's actually over 60, Scott.
Oh, really? Is it that many? I just plowed through that book again this morning. I can't believe I read that much.
Yeah, I'm proud of you.
Now, in reference to Charlie Reese's piece in your book.
Yeah.
Reese's piece, that sounded terrible, I'm sorry. That reminded me of another section in the book where there's an article by Claes Wren, author of the book America the Virtuous. And you said something in reference to the Reese piece about, about America is so good and so wonderful that the law doesn't really matter because we know it has to be done and the ends justify the means, and we have to export our wonderful Anglo-Saxon traditions of liberalism and free markets to the world, and if they don't accept it, they're going to have to accept it.
Right. Yeah, well, and Rin's piece is a good one. As you know, he's extremely well known as a scholar of history, culture, and philosophy, and he really brings all those talents to this piece where he argues. And in fact, this piece is a slightly modified version of something that appeared in his America the Virtuous book. So it really captures the highlights and the best parts of that work that he produced here in the last couple of years. But his argument is effectively that we're no better than the Jacobins of the French Revolution under Robespierre and some of these other nuts who, perhaps with the best of intentions, although I'm inclined to doubt it, felt that this new era that they were ushering in was so wonderful that anyone who didn't want to experience its blessings was either a little bit backwards, behind the times, perhaps mentally ill, or at any rate just abnormal, such that they felt themselves perfectly justified at exporting, much the way Napoleon did some years afterwards, exporting this French Revolution at gunpoint, with military force, with legal terror at home, and foreign policy terror abroad. And he compares that experience of a couple hundred years ago with the experience of the rest of the world sort of suffering under the neoconservative hijacking of American foreign policy.
So then you would suggest that America's foreign policy should not resemble that of Napoleon Bonaparte?
No, not at all, not at all. And again, because Napoleon was a very inconsistent liberal in the sense that he believed in freedom and human rights and a lot of these buzzwords that we hear ad nauseum today. But the freedom or the rights of someone to oppose his project was not a right that he conceded to anyone, which is why he tried to conquer Europe in order to shove these so-called rights down everyone's throat. And again, that's the same experience we have in Baghdad and in the rest of Iraq and even in Afghanistan. You hear constant reference to the flourishing of women's rights in Afghanistan, which, all things considered, women's rights may be a fine thing, but ask any of the mothers and fathers who have lost sons or daughters in the military in Afghanistan and ask them how much willing they were to sacrifice the life of their son or daughter in exchange for this dubious women's rights. And I think you'll universally find them saying it probably wasn't worth it, because at what point do we agree that it's the American obligation to export Western-style, or even more properly, exclusively American-style freedom everywhere else at the expense of lives, infrastructure, money? I mean, the costs just go on and on.
We lose our liberty as we export it.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I suppose if they hate us for our freedom, destroying our freedom might be a good defense against them, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, sadly, that seems to be the case. The whole thing's very ironic in how all these things come together. But that's to get back to the article by Charlie Rees. He starts off by the title, I think, in fact, is even legal nonsense, which is a comment that Elizabeth Wilmshurst made. Elizabeth Wilmshurst was a very senior lawyer in the British government up till April of 2003 when she resigned over the fact that Tony Blair followed King Bush into Iraq. And she said she thought the war on terror was legal nonsense. And Charlie Rees seized on that and wrote a short column based on the idea that the war on terror is about as coherent as the war on obesity and about as successful as the war on drugs. It just doesn't make any sense, but it's another buzzword designed to get everyone excited and supportive of the American military escapades, which really don't achieve much of anything. And, of course, that's also covered in this interview I mentioned before the break by Professor Record, who's this strategist at the War College, the Air Force War College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, who argues that the war on terror is totally incoherent, and to whatever degree it's worth pursuing, Iraq was an unnecessary distraction and a war of choice, as he called it, rather than a war of necessity.
Do you mind if I give away the two greatest quotes out of the book?
Please do. Would love for you to do it.
They both, of course, belong to Joseph Sobran. Unjustified war is mass murder.
There you go.
With a big period at the end of that. Not much room for argument.
No.
And the other one is, when a politician wrestles with his conscience, he usually wins.
Yeah, that's excellent, isn't it?
Yeah.
Only Sobran can come up with that kind of stuff.
He really is great. And the article that he wrote is very interesting, too. He really gets to the question of, sometimes it's hard. It's already almost halfway through 2005 or, getting there.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember back in 2002 and leading up in the beginning of 2003 and the lead up to this war. The common catchphrase was, well, I'm sure the president knows secret information that we don't know about. And sometimes you just have to trust your leaders. And after all, bin Laden was friends with Saddam Hussein, and everyone kind of believed that. And so that's what Sobrin's article is really about, is whether we should go ahead and grant these people legitimacy until they prove themselves otherwise, or whether we should stay eternally suspicious of them no matter what their promises are.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right, and that gets back to the theme that you opened this discussion with about the Catholic position. Even many of the Catholics, especially Michael Novak, who's such a sad excuse for a Catholic thinker or Catholic philosopher, who argues all the time based on, typically the Catholics have a very strong leaning in favor of authority. You obey your parents, you obey the police, you obey your teachers, you obey the government. And as far as that goes, those are all legitimate principles, and they're all necessary for society to function. But at the end of the day, the argument from these Novak-style Catholics is that when the government says go to war, the citizens are just supposed to blindly shut up and be led like sheep to the slaughter in many cases. And as you will find in reading some of these articles, one is by William Kavanaugh in the first volume. Another is by Peter Choinowski, who begins with a CH, if you can believe that. It's a complicated last name, but they're both philosophers from various colleges, and they really blow the lid off of this thing, the idea that you have to just follow your government blindly. Their argument is that if the conscience of an individual citizen, an individual soldier, an individual mother and father is convinced that the war is unjust, then you have no other choice but to follow your conscience. And to me, if you want to talk about rights and freedom, it's the rights and freedom of that kind of correctly informed conscience that marks the highest traditions of not only of this country but of all Western civilization. And these militarists and blowhards are the ones who are destroying what little good is left in our society in that regard.
Tell me about Eric Margolis's piece.
Well, Margolis, as I mentioned, is a foreign policy specialist. He's the editor of the Toronto Sun for foreign policy issues, and I think his column is syndicated in a number of places, including all of the Sun media papers. So he's done a lot. He's written a big book on the war in Afghanistan, which has a lot of historical background. And his argument effectively is that this is, I believe the piece is a mirage too far, which is a little bit of play on the old cliche, a bridge too far. In other words, the idea that America is even going to succeed in Iraq in remaking Iraq into our own image is a stretch. But he calls the goal itself a mirage, in the sense that this is a kind of idealistic conception that our foreign policy thinkers have come up with, that you're going to turn Kurds, Shiites, Sunnis, Baathists into this American-style cooperative representative democracy. He says it's just a fantasy. And the sad thing is and this ties in nicely with the piece by Klaus Rinn that you mentioned, the ideological commitment of the guys that come up with these ideas tends in many cases to trump reality. And I think that's the essence of Margolis's piece, is that eventually some of these ideological schemes and dreams are going to come rushing headlong into reality, and they'll hit it like a brick wall because it will just simply not function. Or if it functions for a while, it'll be long enough for it to fall off of everybody's front page in terms of the media, or sort of fade in everyone's memory, as you mentioned, that it's already 2-3 years ago that a lot of this was going on. And by the time the thing does collapse, everyone will really have forgotten what all the issues were, and they certainly won't remember the voices who cautioned against this kind of experiment at the time, which I think is part of the value of what we're doing, is to get these guys on record, on paper, get the project out there. If you indulge me just for a minute, one of the comments I heard lately from someone was how, well, when the history is written of this conflict, then everything will be sorted out. Even Rumsfeld said that a few weeks ago at an open forum he had at the Pentagon, that when a fair history is written of Operation Iraqi Freedom, ... etc. And we're trying to start that process now to get this history on the books and make sure that nobody has the opportunity to forget, or the luxury of forgetting, that there were sane voices raised against this nonsense, and we're trying to give these voices an opportunity to be heard as quickly as possible.
Sounds like Rumsfeld just means, hey, don't try to write the history of this yet.
Yeah,
go ahead and wait 20 years before you start suing under the Freedom of Information Act, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting, Bill Kristol was quoted in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago saying, they asked him, well, was it worth it? And he says, well, you know, in the end, we'll see how it turns out. And if it turns out good, then yes, it was worth it.
Yeah, of course, which is a really sad statement to make to the 1,500 families that have lost sons and daughters. I mean, if this were all a chessboard or a video game, which I think in many cases a lot of these guys, they mix up virtual reality with real reality in the sense that they're playing a great game of Stratego or whatever the new, I'm not a computer gamer, but I'm sure there's lots of good games out there that deal with strategy and how to take over the world in a 1.5-hour session on your machine. But these guys forget that there are real costs, and I think that gets us back to the uniquely Christian contribution of this just war position is it never forgets the cost. The reason why the criteria for a legitimate military action are so strict and so stringent is because effectively what you're exchanging for whatever your aim is flesh and blood. You know, real lives of real people that have real mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And we'll see how it turns out. Strikes me as an arrogant and frankly asinine response to the loss of 1,500 Americans, and who knows how many thousands of Iraqis, which are, human beings whose lives are as valuable as the rest of us.
How do you explain the split between the Catholic position and the Protestant position in the United States, besides the completely kooky, rapturist, dispensationalist types? But it seems like most generally mainstream Protestant Americans go along, and I don't know about most Catholics, I guess, but I do know that a lot of the leaders of the paleoconservative movement and libertarian movement are Catholic. Is it just because of the just war standard? Because you're all Christians, right?
Yeah, I think Scott, there may not be as, and I say this regretfully, there may not be as big a split as you think, because the folks that you evidently like to follow quite a bit, Sobran, Buchanan, and others, they are Catholic, and that's to their credit, and it reflects highly, I think, upon the Church and upon Catholicism in general. But sadly, they're not in the mainstream. I mean, the guys who capture all the attention are guys like Michael Novak of the American Enterprise Institute, which is this hotbed of insane warmongering. George Weigel, who's the Pope's biographer, who claims to be the Pope's close friend, and certainly we will hear an outpouring of grief from Weigel over the Pope's passing, but Weigel certainly will pass over the things that I'm proud of in our recent Pope in terms of his opposition to the war and opposition to neoliberal economics and some of these other things. Weigel's another one. Richard John Newhouse, who in fact is a convert from Lutheranism to Catholicism, who runs this magazine First Things. They were very much in favor of the war. So if you're thinking that mainstream Protestantism generally went along with the war, I think the sad fact is that to a large extent mainstream Catholics went along with the war in just the same way. And it really are the exceptions to the rule from both camps. Just as there were exceptions on the Catholic side among the left, you have folks at the Catholic Worker in Houston and New York who were very outspoken. You have the paleo-conservatives and the quote-unquote traditionalists like Father Escarra who were very good on the war. Some of the extreme quote-unquote right-wing, if you don't mind the term, although I try not to use right and left because they're meaningless these days, of the church. The traditional movement in Catholicism was very good on the war. But among Protestants, you have guys like the gentleman who wrote the great essay in our book, which is entitled Christian Killers, which I'm not sure if you saw
Vance,
it or you remember it, right? But Lawrence Vance did a tremendous job, and his argument is based on nothing other than quotes from the Bible.
He has actually a new book, which is a collection of all of his LouRockwell.com essays called Christianity and War.
Christianity and War. Yep, and I think the subtitle is something like and other essays against the warfare state.
Right.
And again, he's as far as I'm concerned, he's a model citizen when it comes to conservative or evangelical Protestant. And I think anyone who accepts the authority of the Bible and the teachings of the Catholic Church, I mean, they're going to find themselves in the same camp, which is why I was so happy to be able to include Vance's piece along with the other articles by Catholics, because it really shows that sincere Christians from all backgrounds should come down on the same side. And it's sadly just kind of a negative reflection on mainstream Christianity in general that there was so little response to this.
Let's talk a little bit about the rapturists and the Christian Zionists.
Yep.
Pat Robertson, and Jerry Falwell, basically, their brand of born-again Christianity has it that it is the duty of the United States of America to guarantee the land of Israel, I don't know, probably all the way to the Tigris, so that Jesus will come back and kill everybody.
Yeah.
And they're in a big hurry for that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and the rest of us will be left behind, as the saying goes. The saddest thing about this crowd, and another good example is this guy who writes for WorldNet Daily, which I kind of enjoy. I obviously don't accept everything from what you read at that news site, but I think there are some thought-provoking comments. Gordon Prather writes for them, as you know. But Joseph Farah, who writes and kind of passes himself off as an Arab Christian, is really kind of a pathetic Zionist, to be honest with you. And the article you mentioned earlier by David Lutz, L-U-T-Z, who's a philosopher teaching in Africa currently.
The article is called Unjust War Theory, Christian Zionism and the Road to Jerusalem.
Right. And, of course, the title is a play on this phrase, the road to Jerusalem rolls through Baghdad, in the sense that, well, if we shore up the situation in Iraq by installing a Western-style democracy, that will solve the problem in Palestine, which Farah maintains. And maybe we can get back to that just shortly, because Lutz does a very good job of attacking the nonsense that Farah has spouted on through his WorldNet Daily columns. Okay, and that'll be a great way to wrap up this interview, is the alliance between the Likud of Pat Buchanan's article and the Christian Zionists of Lutz's article. So we'll be right back with the editor of Neocon, Forrest Sharpe. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with J. Forrest Sharpe from IHS Press. He's the editor of the new 2-book series called Neocon, which has been endorsed by Bishop Mark Coleridge, Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne, Bishop Richard Williamson of Argentina, Congressman Ron Paul, who makes James Madison look like Alexander Hamilton, Congressman Danny K. Davis from Illinois. Let's see here. On my list, David Allen White, professor of English at the U.S. Naval Academy. Boy, I wonder if he's in trouble. Lou Rockwell, director of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Joseph Kelly, editorial director of the Universe Catholic Weekly. And the list goes on and on. Got Jesse Jackson Jr. liked it. Congressman Walter B. Jones, Republican from North Carolina, liked it. Congressman James P. Moran. Wow, it's good to know there's actually some House Republicans reading this book, huh? Yeah, that was very refreshing and inspiring for us. Also, Paul Craig Roberts, former Treasury Secretary under Ronald Reagan. Yeah, he's a very good man. Okay, now, the second chapter of this book is called Whose War by Pat Buchanan. Yeah. And we left off before the break talking about the Christian Zionists, basically. Mm-hmm. And so now this gets back into the neoconservative Zionists and Pat Buchanan's war. And I guess the tie between the two, I remember a story, I think, about didn't Irving Kristol arrange for the Israelis to buy a plane for Jerry Falwell to go around and I can't confirm Zionism? That it was Kristol, although you're probably right. But something like that. But Lutz documents that they bought him a Learjet, both to facilitate his ministry, quote unquote, and as a thank you for all the work he's done in generating support for Israel among Christians. So let's get into the meat of the Pat Buchanan article here, Whose War? The first thing he does, basically, in the article is attacks the slander that if you say neoconservative, what you really mean is Jewish conservative. Right, and I think, frankly, the response to that, and Buchanan certainly does a great job of it, is it's one of these, the Shakespearean line, methinks he doth protest too much. I mean, my sense is if you attack neoconservatives, then effectively you're attacking neoconservatives. And the neoconservatives who respond with, well, you really mean Jewish, to me that reveals the very sad and unfortunate connection that has developed between, again, Israel and the Christian right, between Israel and the American defense and foreign policy establishment, and between the neoconservatives' own conception of their own identity. I mean, to the extent that this assertion is correct, that to say neoconservative really means Jewish. I think that's a reflection on the Jewish neoconservatives themselves, because they recognize in their own minds that the way they uniquely interpret their own Jewishness is to interpret it in the interest of Israel, and it's a strictly secular, political, foreign policy kind of perspective that these guys have, which is, because I'm Jewish, it doesn't mean much about how I should behave personally. We all know the stories and rumors about Wolfowitz, dating this Muslim woman and whatever. I mean, the religion never gets in the way of their personal lives, but it certainly does dictate, according to their own understanding of it, that they have a rabid, non-negotiable support for Israel. And anyone who disputes that, I would refer him to an April 16th, 2004 interview with the ever-famous Natan Sharansky in a Berkeley magazine, who effectively said that there are two kinds of Jews in the world, the kinds that are Israeli citizens and the kind that will be Israeli citizens eventually. And I think that gives the lie to this whole perspective.
Well, and the fact of the matter is what makes them neocons is that they're all ex-communists, not that they're Jews.
Trotskyites.
Right. Okay, J. Forrest Sharpe, he's the editor of the new book, Neocon. Where can they find this on the web somewhere? Very quickly,
they can find it on Amazon.com. They can call 1-877-IHS-PRESS, IHS-PRES, and in 2 weeks they'll be able to find it at the website neocon.com.
Neocon.com. All right, and coming up in the next hour, all about Chapter 1 with Jude Wanniski, the bogus case against Saddam. Thank you very much, Mr. Sharpe.
Thanks, Scott. It was a pleasure.